Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to another video. My name is Smurfy and today we're going to be talking about something that's probably a little bit more in depth than what a lot of people are going to be interested in. So this is how to work out at least what I think is the optimal way to work out the mana base for 5-color zoo. It's quite complicated because you're trying to get domain whilst also getting using all your mana every turn, and the deck is quite color intensive, so it's quite a complicated thing to work out. So I thought I would do a video on how I've worked out what I think is the correct mana base, using just like math and things like that. So if you're not interested in this video, please feel free to click away. This isn't for a lot of people. This is mainly for the people that are really into Zoo and want to get the best mana base possible, because I've recently been tweaking my mana base and I found that the chances of me being able to cast all my spells and get domain and everything at the same time was significantly higher just from a couple of tweaks. So if you do want to see this video, then stick around. It's probably going to take a little bit of time, so get comfortable. So the deck that you have in front of you, which we are looking at now, is pretty standard for 5-color domain zoo. So this is the mana base that we're going to try and build the deck for. The bottom 3 cards, Remand, Teferi, where are we? And the Remands and Teferi are the flex slots. So these are the ones that are quite commonly swapped out for other things. It can be Dramoka's Command. It can be other counter spells and things like that. There's a bunch of different options, but basically most of the deck is pretty solidified at this point. So the first thing that I want to figure out with the mana base is I will need to know things about the deck. So what do we know about the deck? So first of all, we know that it's mostly a red-green deck. It's a red-green zoo deck. It uses all 5 colors of mana, mainly for domain. So it needs to have domain as quickly as possible. It needs things for Sign of Draco. If you don't have domain 5 for Draco, then it's a 4-drop, which is just very hard to cast. We need our Carvus to be as big as possible, our Neoshiba Brawlers to be as big as possible, Trail Flames, and Leyline Binding. So domain as soon as possible is incredibly vital for the deck's success. Not only do we need to have the right colours of mana, but we need to have domain 5 as well. So our turn 1 plays are typically going to be green for Wild Nakato, or a red land for Ragavan. If we don't have one of our 2 1-drops in the deck, then our opening play is probably going to be go fetch a Triome, because that allows you to get domain 5 on turn 2 by getting the corresponding Triome to go with it. That's pretty standard in Modern at this point. You get the Triome, which pairs with a shock land, and that gives you domain 5. So from our turn 1 plays, we already know that Watery Grave, Hallowed Fountain, and Godless Shrine are not going to be our turn 1 shock land. You're never going to go fetch shock for a Hallowed Fountain, Watery Grave, or Godless Shrine. It doesn't cast either of our 1-drops, and it was also none of these will allow us to play a Carvu on turn 2. So these are just completely ruled out as our go-to turn 1 fetch shock. So the next thing we will need to look at is the mana base is, although that we're going for domain and everything, there's only one color in our deck that we don't actually use main deck, and that's black. You need a swamp in the deck for domain, but you never are casting any black spells, at least for main deck, unless you're changing and playing Thoughtseize or something. So I think it's fairly safe to assume that we're not going to be going to get a Blood Crypt or an Overgrown Tomb on turn 1, because it's essentially the worst red or green lands that we could play. We have blue and white spells on our deck, so you'd much be better off with a Temple Garden or a Steam Vents, for example, because then that would allow you to play things like Binding or Stubborn Denial. Whereas you're not using black other than domain, so we're not going to worry about that for turn 1 or turn 2 either. I think the land that probably stands out for most people is going to be Stomping Ground. So the deck is red-green. It seems very obvious that Stomping Ground is going to be the best land in the deck. You're a red-green deck, obviously you want to play Stomping Grounds. I actually strongly disagree with that, so let's just run it through a couple of different scenarios. So turn 1, you fetch shock and you play your Wild Nakato or your Ragavan. This is fantastic. You've got your red and your green mana, which is the 2 most common colours in your deck, and it can play either of your 1-drops, which is really nice. So then turn 2, we want to play a Carvu. So we want to go get one of our other lands in our deck. So we're going to get one that's probably a blue or a white land. The reason for this is it then gives us more domain and it allows us to cast our spells. The problem with that is, because we've already got red and green, and our next land is probably going to have red or green on it, that means our Carvu is only a 3/3, because if you play a Stomping Ground, you're going to have to get one of these 4 lands to be able to cast a Carvu, which means it dies to Bolt because you've only got domain 3. Alright, so what if we try going Stomping Ground and we don't have a Carvu? So we go Stomping Ground into one of our other lands. That gives us 3 domain. So now on turn 4, if we want to get domain 5, we now have to go get a Watery Grave, a Godless Shrine, or a Hallowed Fountain, because you've got 2 of your domain 5 in your stomping ground. All of these lands can only give you an extra 1 because you've only added either white or blue, which means you then have to go add black or white or black or blue or whatever to get the Hallowed Fountain, the Watery Grave, or the Godless Shrine. So you don't want to be playing these in your deck at all. So Stomping Ground not only doesn't allow you to get domain 4 on turn 2, it also means you can't even get domain 5 on turn 3 unless you play really, really bad shock lands in your deck. So for that reason, I don't think it's great. So the next thing we need to consider is, if we really do want to play a Stomping Ground, what Triome does it pair with that works really nicely in the deck? So you go get Triome turn 1, and then you go turn 2 Stomping Ground, for example. Well, it's paired with Rafine's Tower to give you domain 5. Rafine's Tower is literally the 3 least common colours that you're going to need in your deck. So you can't turn 2 Kavu from it. It has blue and white, which there are only about 4 to 6 cards in each colour of those. So it's just a very, very useless land to have, especially as early as turn 1 or 2. So because of that, I don't want to play Rafine's Tower, and because of that, I also really don't want to play Stomping Ground. It's really bad for getting domain quickly. It's really bad with Territorial Kavu. It just doesn't work in the deck. Is counterintuitive as it is, I don't think a red-green shock should go in a red-green zoo deck, which is crazy. So through process of elimination, the most common lands that we're probably going to want to fetch or shock for turn 1 is going to be Temple Garden, Sacred Foundry, Steam Vents, or Breeding Pool. All of these allow you to get red or green on turn 1, and then the secondary colour allows you to go get the opposite to then play a Kavu or whatever, and they give you domain 4 really, really easily. So probably an easier way to lay them out is like this, and to separate them. So a Breeding Pool and a Sacred Foundry together gives you domain 4 on turn 2, so you can go one into the other, play a Kavu, and or you can go one into the other and play a Neoshiba Brawler, whatever you want to do. This gives you domain 4 either way, but they essentially do the same thing. You can turn 1 Kavu, for example, off a Breeding Pool or a Temple Garden, and then you go get the other one to get domain 4. Alternatively, if you've got a Ragavan in hand, you go fetch the Sacred Foundry or the Steam Vents. So we need to distinguish which pair of these lands is better. So as we've said, they both allow you to go get turn 2 Kavu, because the red and the green is spread out over 2 lands, unlike something like a Stomping Ground. And they both make it a 4/4, so you don't have to worry about Lightning Bolt. But out of the two, which one is better? So first of all, let's look at Breeding Pool and Sacred Foundry. So Breeding Pool and Sacred Foundry have a very, very nice convenient spread of mana, because it allows you to play Dromoka's Command as soon as turn 2. So Dromoka's Command is a really commonly played card in Zoo. It's really, really good against Urza's Saga, because you can make your opponent sacrifice a land as well as having another effect, because it allows you to make your opponent sacrifice an enchantment. Sagas are enchantments, which means you can go as soon as turn 2 with this mana base, make your opponent sacrifice their Saga. So you can even possibly make it so they can't ever gain a construct out of their land, and you just make them sacrifice it straight away. So Dromoka's Command is really, really powerful for getting rid of the Sagas, as early as turn 2 as well, which is really good. However, Temple Garden Steam Vents doesn't allow that. Temple Garden's got your green and your white, which means that unless you go fetch another green or white land, which is terrible for getting domain on turn 2, Dromoka's Command is just, it doesn't work very well with the Temple Garden. So for that reason, I'm going to give Breeding Pool and Sacred Foundry a point, whereas the pair of Temple Garden and Steam Vents we're not going to give any points, because it doesn't let you do Dromoka's Command very easily. So the next card we need to think about is going to be Wild Nakato. So Wild Nakato is a very common turn 1 player in the deck. So you fetch a Breeding Pool on turn 1, you play a Wild Nakato, you've got a 1/1. You use a Temple Garden and you get a 2/2. Generally that's not going to be too relevant, because by the next turn anyway, you're going to go fetch the corresponding shock land and it's going to be a 3/3. So it shouldn't really be too relevant. However, there is one particular card in Modern that is quite popular and seems to pop up pretty much everywhere, and that's Wrenn and 6. So let's just play it out. You're on the draw, your opponent's on the play. They lead off with a tapped land. You play your Breeding Pool, you tap it, you play a Wild Nakato. Your Wild Nakato is a 1/1 because you played a Breeding Pool. Your opponent untaps, they play their land, they play a Wrenn and 6. They can now minus Wrenn and 6 and kill your Wild Nakato because it's a 1/1. However, if that was a Temple Garden, it would actually be a 2/2. Therefore, Wrenn and 6 can't kill your Wild Nacatl, and you can't get blown out by their turn 2 Planeswalker that kills your creature and sticks around. If you do have it where you play a Wild Nacatl and your opponent Wrenn and 6 minuses and kills it, not only does it feel horrible, but it is just really, really bad tempo loss. It's source of card advantage. It's just an awful exchange for you to have. So Temple Garden, significantly better there. It also means that if you use a Temple Garden, it can block a Swift Spear if your opponent is on the draw instead. So Temple Garden, making your Wild Nacatl bigger sooner, is definitely stronger than a Breeding Pool. So that makes it 1-0. The next thing that I want to have a look at is sideboard cards. So Veil of Summer plus Stubborn Denial is very, very common to hold up against combo decks. It allows you to interact with your opponent, and then if they have counter magic back, you can protect your spells. So if you look at Sacred Foundry and Breeding Pool, that's not going to work very nicely. The combo does work really nicely for Dromoka's command, but because your green and blue are on the same land, you can't Stubborn Denial plus Veil of Summer very easily. Alternatively, Temple Garden plus Steam Vents does allow you to do so. So your Temple Garden allows you to play your Veil of Summer and your Stubborn Denial with your Steam Vents. So again, that's another point to Temple Garden and Steam Vents. As I've said, Wrenn and 6 is a really good reason to play Temple Garden for your Wild Nacatl. However, if it does get the Banhammer, maybe Temple Garden isn't as important. Alternatively, if Urza's Saga becomes the most common land played in Modern, and it's in all the top decks, which it already is kind of, but if it becomes even more popular, then Dromoka's command becomes significantly more powerful because you want to be able to counter the early Saga. So for now, I think that Temple Garden and Steam Vents is the better option. But as I said, if Urza's Saga becomes really, really popular, or Wrenn and 6 gets banned, then this can easily change. But for now, Temple Garden and Steam Vents, in my opinion, is going to be the better option. So we now need to determine the rest of the lands in the deck. So we're going to go for 21 lands in the deck. I'm not going to go over the reasons why. That would just make this video even longer. So we're going to skip over that, and we're going to assume that you're on the same page, that we're going to go for 21 lands. So we need to get some triomes in the deck. And we already know what our 2 primary fetches are. So our 2 primary shock lands. So we're just going to go with the pairs that go with them. That way, if you don't have a turn 1 play, you can go get your Triumph. Turn 2, you can go get the corresponding shock land, and you get domain 5 on turn 2. Nice and easy. And if you need to get it later on, they're just a really good land to have access to. So the Temple Garden, you tap it, you play a Wild Nacatl, and you untap it, and you play a Steam Vents. So you've now got domain 4, and you tap them, you can play a Kavu. This is really nice. This is going to be the most standard play in the deck, pretty much. From all my testing of literally months of testing this deck, that is very, very common, that you want to go shock into shock land. The reason for that is you have a lot of turn 1 plays, but you also have a lot of turn 2 plays. So you don't always have time to get a triome. But what that often means is that then the next turn, you might want to cast cast 2 spells in one turn that need domain. So for example, if you only wanted to play the Sign of Draco, you could go get the Triumph, and that's nice and easy. You've got 2 mana and you've got domain. But if you want to use all 3 of your mana on turn 3, you're going to need to get a black source that comes in untapped and not tapped from the Triumph. So we are going to have to play a black shockland. If you want to be able to do things like play a Draco plus a Bolt, or a Draco plus a Lane Line Binding, or Stubborn Denial, whatever the case is, you do need to have a shockland. And I think that if you play without a shockland that's black, you're going to really mess up your turn 3s when this is like a very common play. So we do need to play one of these shocklands, which is black. We've already discussed that the most common colours in the deck are green and red. White and blue are more of like a splash colour. So we're going to instantly rule them out. We really don't want our black source to be also an off-colour land as well. Because if you play, for example, a Watery Grave, the black is irrelevant, you only need it for the swamp, and then you've only got 2 Ramans, 4 Stubborn Denials, and a Teferi in your deck to cast from the blue. So a lot of the time the Watery Grave will just be essentially a colourless land that gives you domain. Same with the Godless Shrine. So we want to keep the black source as useful as possible, and the way to do that is to use it as a mountain or a forest. So which one is the better option? I think that it's pretty obvious that you can go with either. So what we're going to do is we're going to go with the rest of the deck, and we're going to leave that on the back burner because we need to still determine what else we want to play in the deck, and then maybe it'll become more clear. So the next thing that we wanted to think about is Fire and Ice. So why do we need to think about Fire and Ice? The reason for that is it's very, very commonly played at the moment. And the reason it's very commonly played is because you can end of turn tap someone's land down, that's their blue source or their counter spell or whatever, and then they can untap and then do their combo. So the problem with that is that we can answer it if we have a fetch land, for example. So we can go fetch our Steam Vents or our Breeding Pool. However, the problem is that if you've already drawn your Steam Vents or you've used your Steam Vents on turn 1 and then you play your fetch on turn 2, you then can no longer go get your blue source because we're only playing one blue fetch at the one blue shock land at the moment. So I actually think it's correct to play both, and then that way, if you need to go turn 1 Steam Vents into Ragavan, the next turn, if you want to keep up a counter spell, you can just play your Misty Rainforest, not crack it. Then if your opponent tries to Fire and Ice you, then you can then fetch it in response and get a Breeding Pool. So basically, this allows you to play around Fire and Ice even if you need to get your blue shockland early. So I think it's really, really important to have 2 fetchable blue sources in the deck that come in untapped. This allows you to keep up counter spells around Fire and Ice even if you draw the only blue shock in your deck. So we play a second one. It also allows you to have 2 blue sources that you can go fetch and shock, and you can play things like Teferi with counter spell protection. So that's really powerful as well. So we're going to play the Breeding Pool. Even though we're playing the Steam Vents, we do want 2 blue sources. And because we're playing the Breeding Pool, I think that then makes it fairly obvious that we don't need the Overgrown Tomb. We might as well take the Blood Crypt, and then it just spreads our mana out better between red and green. So you've got the Breeding Pool for your second blue source, and now you've got your Blood Crypt as your fetchable black source, but it's also got red in it. So you can actually make use of the land and not only just have it as a domain. So that leaves us with 6 lands. The next thing that we need to consider is a basic. So there is Boseiju floating around everywhere. There are things like Blood Moon, Path to Exile. Sometimes you play against Burn and you just want to fetch a land that comes in untapped and not have to pay life for it. So we probably do want to play a fetch. As we've already discussed, the deck doesn't really use black, so we're not going to go fetch a swamp. That would be very, very bad for our mana. So the next thing that we need to think about is Blood Moon. So Blood Moon absolutely hoses this deck, and if your opponent resolves a Blood Moon, well, you're not going to need a mountain, so we're not going to be playing mountain either. So then we have 3 lands left over. We have Plains, Island, and Forest. Well, I think that if you play Natural State to get around Blood Moon, then it makes sense to play a Forest, but that's a sideboard card. So I would prefer to have a main deck option out of Blood Moon. So for that reason, we do play Binding. We play Binding regardless anyway, but because Binding answers Blood Moon so efficiently and as main deck, I think your best option is to go with the Plains. I think there is justification to play the Forest, but it just makes more sense that if you've got Binding in your main deck, you can then still beat a Blood Moon game 1. I don't really want to play 2 basics because you're still trying to get domain 5. So I think Plains is the best option in that case. So that gives us 7 of our lands in our deck. We've got the 2 pairs of Steam Vents with the Indepth Triome, Temple Garden with the Xander's Lounge. We've got the second backup blue shockland with Breeding Pool, our fetchable black source that comes in untapped in Blood Crypt, and then our basic that we can go fetch in Plains. So we're playing 21 lands, 7 of which we are happy with being fetchable lands, so shocklands or triomes or a basic. That gives us 14 spaces for fetch lands. So we need to determine which fetch lands to use, of course. So what I've done here is I've just gone through all of the different fetches and shown you which ones can get our 4 priority lands, which is going to be the 2 triomes and the 2 priority shocklands. So we can see that Flooded Strand, Arid Mesa, Misty Rainforest, and Wooded Foothills, which are the top 4, can get all 4 of those lands no problem. So I think those are pretty clearly the best lands for us to play. So we need to determine which of those is best, because if you play 4 of each, well, that's too many lands, that's 16. So we don't want 16, we want 14. So what we're going to do is we're going to work out which of those 4 lands is best with the rest of our mana base. So as you can see here, Flooded Strand, Arid Mesa, and Wooded Foothills can all get 2 of the 3 backup lands. and Misty Rainforest can only get Breeding Pool. So Misty Rainforest is pretty clearly the worst out of the best 4 fetches in the deck. For that reason, we're just going to go with Flooded Strand, Arid Mesa, and Wooded Foothills as a playset of all. And then the next best option is Misty Rainforest, so we're going to be playing 2 of those. That gives us 14 fetches. So from that gives us our 21 lands. That gives us the easiest ability to go Shockland, and Shockland into Domain on turn 3, whilst giving you access to the mana every single turn. So you can go Temple Garden into wherever it is, Steam Vents, and then you can go get a Blood Crypt, and that gives you Domain 5 on turn 3, but you've had access to mana every single turn. Alternatively, you can do other bizarre things, like you can go, if you really need to, you can go things like Breeding Pool into Blood Crypt, into Plains, and that gives you Domain 5 on turn 3 as well, whilst getting a basic, which is quite nice. So I think this Manabase is by far the best option. I think that it gives you the most reliable fetch lands, it gives you the most reliable shock lands, it keeps your Wild Nacatl as powerful as possible, it allows you to play your sideboard cards as fluently as possible with your main deck. So I think that is the best way to build the deck. If you have any suggestions on what you think might be better, then please feel free to comment it. I think from the process of elimination, I do think this is the correct one, but I'm more than happy to be proven wrong. If you were unsure about how to build Zoo, or the mana base for it, I think this is the best way to do it. If the deck changes, you can still use this exact theory and just tune it, and then, for example, if all of a sudden black becomes very common in the deck and blue, for example, completely disappears out of the deck, well, you can just switch accordingly. So I think that the tools that you learn from this process gives you the ability to build the deck regardless of how it changes. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more content, feel free to subscribe. This is by far one of my more infographic style videos instead of like gameplay and things like that. This is, I think, the first time I've ever done this, but it was something that really interested me, and I've spent weeks and weeks and weeks trying to figure out the best mana base, tuning it and trying out different things depending on the metagame and things. So I thought I would share it with you guys, because if anyone else has gone through half as much trouble as I have trying to figure the best mana base, then it will save you a lot of time and a little bit of food for thought. Thanks for watching, guys. If you want to see more content, feel free to subscribe, as I said, particularly if you want to play Domain Zoo and you want to pick up tips and things like that. I play it a hell of a lot. So thanks for watching, guys. Peace.